where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
In 2015, geneticists tested the DNA of living descendants connected to Abraham Lincoln's mother. They expected a straightforward answer to a 150-year-old question about her birth. What they found was something no one in that lab was prepared for. A genetic marker so rare it should not exist in any family with colonial American roots. That one discovery alone changed what we know about Lincoln's maternal line. But here's what made it dangerous. That same DNA confirmed a secret Lincoln had been hiding his entire life. Something so damaging he confessed it only once, to one man on a dirt road in Illinois, and then begged him never to repeat it. For over a century, historians fought viciously over whether that confession was even true. The DNA ended the argument. But what it uncovered about where Lincoln's bloodline actually traces to, that's the part nobody saw coming. And it all starts with a crime committed in 1789. The confession. Here's what Lincoln told Herndon on that. Ride. According to Herndon's own account, Lincoln said, "Billy, I'll tell you something, but keep it a secret while I live. My mother was a bastard, was the daughter of a nobleman so-called of Virginia. Let that land for a second. The man who would preserve the Union, end slavery, and deliver the Gettysburg Address, sitting in a buggy on a back road in Illinois, admitting that his own mother was born illegitimate, not in some private study behind closed doors, on a public road, trusting that his law partner would guard the most dangerous sentence he'd ever spoken. He believed his intelligence, his analytical mind, his ambition, all came from some mysterious, well-bred Virginia planter whose name was never written down. Then he added something that still echoes. God bless my mother. All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her." Herndon kept his word. For decades, he said nothing publicly. But Lincoln didn't survive his presidency, and those words, that confession on a dirt road in Illinois, would eventually crack open a debate that consumed historians for over a century. Now, here's why that confession was so dangerous. In 19th century America, if you were born outside of marriage, you were legally nobody. The law called you filius nullius, nobody's child. You couldn't inherit from your father. You had no claim to a family name or property, and the stigma followed you like a brand. Unwed mothers faced criminal prosecution, public whipping, fines, imprisonment in workhouses. Even after the punishments ended, the shame never did. Families buried the truth for generations, raising illegitimate children as cousins or nephews rather than speak the word out loud. And in politics, illegitimacy was a loaded gun. Your enemies could use it to shred your character, question your morality, argue you had no right to hold office. Lincoln understood this. He'd seen how reputations were built and destroyed in 19th century campaigns. That's why he made Herndon swear silence. But think about who his mother actually was before we go further. Nancy Hanks was born around 1784 on the rough frontier edge of Virginia, what's now Mineral County, West Virginia. This wasn't Boston or Philadelphia, with established churches and meticulous records. This was backcountry America, where families moved constantly. Churches were scarce, and official documentation was an afterthought. No birth certificate survives for Nancy. No church record identifies both her parents. She was raised from infancy by her grandparents, Joseph and Ann Lee Hanks. When Joseph died around 1793, 9-year-old Nancy was passed to her Aunt Elizabeth Hanks and Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Sparrow. She grew up as Nancy Sparrow, a name that only deepened the confusion around her origins. And get this, the Sparrows also raised another illegitimate child alongside Nancy. Dennis Hanks, born in 1799 to Nancy's youngest aunt. Illegitimacy ran through this family like a thread. Nobody. He wanted to pull. But here's what the neighbors remembered about Nancy. They called her intelligent, deeply religious, remarkably capable. She taught herself to read on the frontier, rare for anyone in backcountry America, let alone a woman born into her circumstances. She learned needlework. She worked for families across the neighborhood. Whatever shame the law tried to hang on her, it never defined who she actually became. She married Thomas Lincoln in 1806. They had 3 children, Sarah, Abraham, and Thomas Jr., who died in infancy. And Lincoln carried his mother's secret his entire political life, knowing one leaked document could unravel everything. Because that document existed, and it had been sitting in a Kentucky courthouse for over a century. The evidence nobody could ignore. Deep in the Mercer County, Kentucky archives, researchers found a record dated November 24th, 1789. It showed that a woman named Lucy Hanks, Nancy's mother, had been indicted by a grand jury for fornication. Now, in late 18th century Kentucky, that charge meant one specific thing. An unmarried woman had given birth. The child's very existence was the crime. This wasn't some abstract moral offense noted in a church ledger. It was prosecutable law. Women convicted could be publicly whipped, fined, or locked in a house of correction for months. The timeline was a smoking gun. Nancy was born around 1784, her sister Sarah around 1787. Both arrived before Lucy ever married anyone. The 1789 indictment fit a clear pattern of children born outside wedlock, exactly the pattern you'd expect to trigger a grand jury in frontier Kentucky. And here's the catch. 5 months after that indictment, Lucy Hanks wrote a note, in her own handwriting, giving consent to marry a man named Henry Sparrow. I do certify that I am of age and give my approbation freely for Henry Sparrow to get out license this or any other day. That note still exists. You can see her spelling. You can feel the urgency. Lucy and Henry married on April 30th, 1790. Less than a month later, the court dropped the charges. Marriage had made Lucy respectable again, but Nancy still carried the Hanks name, her mother's maiden name, because in English common law, illegitimate children took their mother's surname. The father remained a ghost. Herndon knew all of this, and for 24 years after Lincoln's assassination, he carried the weight of every word Lincoln had ever told him. He'd spent those years collecting interviews, letters, testimony, building the most complete record of Lincoln's real life that existed anywhere. He had the buggy confession. He had the courthouse records. He had the truth. And he had a promise to a dead man. But by 1889, Herndon had watched biographers and politicians turn Lincoln into a marble saint, a myth, a figure scrubbed clean of anything human. He believed America deserved the real man, the complicated, brilliant, haunted man who'd risen from nothing. And he believed the truth about Nancy Hanks was part of that story. So he made his choice. He published the biography, the unvarnished version, every uncomfortable detail included. He titled it Herndon's Lincoln, the true story of a great life. And that word true was a declaration of war against everyone who wanted the sanitized version. He knew what would happen next, and it happened. Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham's surviving son, was furious. He spent years trying to control his father's image and deeply resented everything Herndon had revealed. Defenders of Lincoln's legacy called Herndon a liar, a drunk, a man nursing a grudge. Some tried to discredit him entirely, but the courthouse records didn't care about reputations. The evidence was real. The problem was, evidence alone couldn't end the fight. For over a century, historians tore each other apart over what those documents meant. William Barton argued Herndon was right. Kentucky researcher Lewis Warren insisted Nancy was legitimate, claiming Lucy Hanks was actually Lucy Shipley, a widow. Warren was certain. In 1941, he declared that making Lincoln's mother illegitimate was just another Herndon myth. The paper trail was too thin, the frontier records too incomplete. Neither side could land a knockout blow. To settle this, they needed something that didn't exist in 1889. They needed to read the genetic code itself. If secrets that rewrite history fascinate you, hit subscribe now. Because what the DNA revealed didn't just settle the debate. It blew the debate apart. The DNA that shattered everything. In 2015, a team of genetic genealogists assembled to do what 150 years of historical research couldn't. Suzanne Hallstrom, Nancy Rexis, Stephen Whitlock, Richard Hulleman, and Gerald Haslam. These weren't casual hobbyists. They were researchers who had spent decades buried in this mystery. Hulleman alone had been chasing Nancy Hanks's maternal ancestry since 1980, 35 years of reading. Every paper he could find at the Allen County Public Library, the University of Chicago, the Library of Congress. 35 years of dead ends, incomplete records, and arguments with other researchers who told him the question was unanswerable. Now, he was about to find out if they were right. Because the team had something no previous generation of researchers could have dreamed of: mitochondrial DNA testing. Here's the deal. Mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively from mother to child through an unbroken female line. It doesn't mix, it doesn't recombine. A woman alive today can carry the exact same mtDNA sequence as an ancestor who lived centuries ago. It's a genetic receipt that never fades. Now, here's the critical problem. Abraham Lincoln has no living descendants. His last confirmed descendant, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, died in 1985 without children. The Lincoln line is extinct, gone. But mtDNA doesn't need Lincoln's descendants. It needs descendants of any woman in his maternal line, the sisters, daughters, and granddaughters of Lucy Hanks, who carried the same genetic signature passed down through centuries. The team spent years tracking these people down through multiple branches of the family tree. They needed individuals who could trace an unbroken female line all the way back to Anne Lee Hanks, Lucy's mother and Nancy's grandmother. And they needed descendants of the Shipley sisters to test Warren's competing theory. They identified two groups. Group A, living female line descendants of Anne Lee Hanks. If Herndon's account was correct, every person in this group would share identical mtDNA. The team collected samples from descendants through multiple daughters of Lucy Hanks and Henry Sparrow, cross-checking across different family branches to make the results airtight. Group B, descendants of the Shipley sisters, Rachel and Naomi Shipley, who Warren's theory claimed were Lucy's actual siblings. The lab at Gene by Gene in Houston ran the analysis. The results were scheduled for announcement on October 21st, 2015, the 151st anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. Think about that moment. Holloman had waited 35 years for this. The entire team had staked their professional reputations on the methodology. Decades of work condensed into data loading on a screen in a Houston laboratory. Group A came back first. Every single descendant traced to Anne Lee Hanks, identical mtDNA, perfect match across every branch. All of them belonging to the same haplogroup. Not similar, identical. Then Group B, the Shipley descendants, completely different DNA. Haplogroup H, one of the most common European lineages. Not even close. The two groups shared no common maternal ancestor, not in historical times, not ever. Holloman stared at the results. Then someone on the team said what everyone was thinking: run it again. They did. Same result. The Shipley theory, the counter-argument that had fueled a century of academic warfare, wasn't just weakened, it was genetically destroyed, eliminated. Lucy Hanks was exactly who Herndon said she was, a Hanks by birth, daughter of Anne Lee Hanks. And Nancy Hanks Lincoln was exactly what Abraham Lincoln had whispered in that buggy, the illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks and an unknown father. A century and a half of debate, incinerated by a DNA sequence. But here's where it gets wild. The team wasn't done reading the results, because buried in that same data was a second finding, a genetic marker so unexpected that it had nothing to do with the legitimacy debate at all. Something ancient, something that should not have been there. The genetic marker that changed everything. When the researchers looked at the specific haplogroup shared by every Hanks line descendant, it stopped them dead. Haplogroup X1C. If you know anything about genetic genealogy, that name should scare you, because X1C doesn't belong in a colonial Virginia family. It shouldn't be anywhere near one. Nobody saw this coming. Here's why. Most Americans with colonial ancestry carry haplogroups like H, J, T, U, or K, standard European lineages reflecting British, Irish, and German origins. Haplogroup H alone accounts for nearly half of all European mtDNA. Test a random person with Virginia colonial roots, and you'd almost certainly find one of those markers. They're common, they're expected. They're what everyone in that lab assumed they'd see. X1C is something else entirely. It traces to North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Near East. Egypt, Ethiopia, the Levant, the Mediterranean coast. It never spread into Northern Europe. The lineage belongs to populations most people would never connect to a frontier family in colonial Virginia. Not in 100 years of guessing. And get this, X1C is one of the rarest sub-branches of its parent group. So rare that finding identical matches across multiple descendants actually strengthened the team's conclusions. A common haplogroup would have been less definitive. The rarity made the evidence bulletproof. But think about what that means. Somewhere deep in the past, hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago, the Hanks maternal line connected to populations in the Mediterranean and Near East. Not recent ancestry, not a family scandal, ancient migration, written into the DNA like a message from a world nobody remembered. Here's the catch. This didn't just rewrite Lincoln's family tree. It blew apart the story Americans have been telling themselves for centuries about who the colonists really were. The idea that early American families were pure British and Irish stock, that was always a myth. Human migration has been constant, messy, and far more complex than any schoolbook ever admitted. The X1C marker proved it. And here's what makes it sting. The same fiction of pure bloodlines that X1C destroyed, that was the exact fiction used to judge, shame, and criminalize people like Nancy Hanks for the circumstances of their birth. The woman the law called nobody's child carried a lineage older and more extraordinary than anyone could have guessed, and so did her son. The woman behind the data. Let's go back to Nancy one more time, because the numbers on that lab screen don't mean anything unless you understand the life behind them. She was born on the frontier edge of Virginia, what's now Mineral County, West Virginia. In 2008, the Mineral County Historical Society officially recognized a research site as her birthplace. In 2009, West Virginia's House of Delegates passed a resolution honoring her on the bicentennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth. But in her own lifetime, none of that recognition existed. She was a girl raised by relatives, carrying a surname that told anyone who understood the law exactly what she was. Nobody's child. Here's the deal, though. By every account that survives, Nancy refused to be defined by it. Neighbors remembered her as intelligent, deeply religious, and fiercely capable. She could read, rare enough for anyone on the frontier, let alone a woman born into her circumstances. She worked hard. She made something of herself in a world that had written her off before she could walk. She married Thomas Lincoln in 1806 and built a life from nothing on the Kentucky frontier. And then, in 1818, milk sickness swept through their Indiana community, a disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten white snakeroot, though nobody understood that yet. It moved through the settlement like a slow-burning fire. Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow, the aunt and uncle who'd raised Nancy from the age of 9, died first. Then, weeks later, Nancy herself fell ill. She was 34 years old when she died. Abraham was 9. He and his father built her coffin with their own hands. No carpenter, no undertaker. A father and a boy, alone on the frontier, hammering together a pine box for the woman who taught him to read. They buried her on a hillside south of the family farm, unmarked for years. Think about that for a second. A 9-year-old boy building a coffin for his mother. A boy who would one day hold the entire nation together through its bloodiest war. And decades later, in a rattling buggy on a dirt road in Illinois, that boy, now a man, now a lawyer, now on the verge of becoming president, would lower his voice and confess the truth about her. The truth he believed could destroy everything he'd built. But there's one more thing this story reveals. And it's not about DNA. What this actually means. Lucy Hanks was a young woman in late 18th century Virginia. She became pregnant outside marriage. That pregnancy made her a criminal. Nancy grew up marked, raised by relatives, carrying her mother's name, knowing exactly what the world thought of her. And Abraham Lincoln rose from all of it. One-room cabin, father who couldn't sign his own name, maybe 18 months of formal, education in frontier schoolhouses, a family that owned nothing, moved constantly, and carried a secret that could have ended everything before it started. He held the Union together through its bloodiest war. He ended slavery. He wrote words that still define what this country claims to be. And he did all of it knowing that somewhere in a Kentucky courthouse, there was a document proving his grandmother had been indicted for the crime of having his mother. The 2015 DNA study confirmed what Lincoln whispered to Herndon over 170 years ago. Nancy Hanks was illegitimate. The Shipley theory is genetically dead. And the rare haplogroup X1C in Lincoln's maternal line proved that the mythology of pure colonial ancestry, the same mythology used to shame and criminalize people like Nancy, was never real. It was a story people told themselves, and they used it to destroy anyone who didn't fit. But here's the thing that stays with me. Lincoln didn't see his mother's story as shame. He saw it as the source of everything he became. He didn't hide from her memory. He honored it, privately, painfully, but completely. All that I am or ever hope to be, I owe to her. He meant those words. And now, after a genetic discovery that changed what we know about his maternal line, we finally understand the weight he was carrying when he said them, and why he needed Herndon to guard them until he was gone. If this changed the way you think about American history, subscribe and hit that bell. And tell me in the comments, what other historical mysteries should modern science crack open next?